Good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me, Tony, and thank you for the kind of introduction. Yeah. So I've been living in East Lothian for the last 35 years and living and working there. I'm retired now, keen diver, sea search, and sea searcher as well. So anyway, tonight I am going to talk to you about the identification of barnacles. So without further ado, I'll just kick off and I'll just quickly go through what I hope to cover. It'll be a little bit about barnacles and how they're classified. We'll then start off with acorn barnacles, since these are probably of most interest for various reasons, and we'll have a little look at stalked barnacles. I won't be doing an exhaustive account of every species that we get around Britain and Ireland. It'll just be a sort of a select few. Okay, so barnacles, what are they? Well, barnacles, in the most complicated terms, I guess, that I could state it, barnacles are arthropods of the subclass Cirripedia in the subphylum Crustacea. They're exclusively marine, and there's just over 2,000 species. They are related to crabs and lobsters, as you all probably know, and they have the similar nauplius larvae, which is planktonic and swims around, obviously, but the barnacle adults are all sessile themselves. They include the stalked or pedunculate barnacles, also known as goose barnacles, as well as the acorn barnacles. And nowadays, the pedunculate and the acorn barnacles are each now split between two or more orders. So the classification has had it's been continually revised all the time. There used to be orders called Pedunculata and Sicilia that covered the barnacles, but they now cover a much wider range of orders within the classification system. So the acorn barnacles, as you'll know, are those forms that are visible on the shore and in the subtidal as well, as small conical shells stuck directly onto the substratum. Whereas the pedunculate barnacles attach themselves by means of a stalk and are occasionally encountered as bunches hanging off flotsam and oceanic debris cast up onto the shore, or which sometimes live on other pelagic animals. There are other groups of Cirripedia as well, which aren't immediately recognizable as barnacles. There are tiny burrowing forms that burrow into rocks and also into shells inhabited by various species, including hermit crabs. And there's also a group in which the species are highly modified parasites on other crustaceans, mostly decapods. And you might have seen some of these, like Sacculina, for example. I'm not going to be talking about those so much. I'm just going to be sticking to the acorn barnacles and to the stalked barnacles. So let's have start a quick wander through the acorn barnacles. Also known as sessile barnacles, even though, as I just said, all adult barnacles are sessile, in fact. The walls of the shell are calcareous, and they include a carinal plate, which is plate number 1 in that little diagram on the right. And plate number 1, as you'll notice from the labeling, is at the posterior end of the animal. It took me a little while to get my own head around this, actually, that what I thought was the front of the animal is in fact its rear end. Anyway, so you also have a rostral plate, plate number 2, at the anterior end, and then you also have either 2 or 4 lateral plates to either side. And those plates are interlocked in a sort of a cunning and secure way. But I should note at this point that the plate shape and also their ornamentation and color, the degree to which they're decorated, they've got ribs or teeth on them, that kind of thing. The plates provide quite an important clue to identification. The aperture itself, which is the hole in the middle that you can see there, can be closed by an operculum. And the operculum consists, I'll call it a lid, if you will. It consists of a pair of small plates. You've got the turga, there's two of them up at the back end there, each labeled number 4. And then just south of them, you've got a pair of larger kite-shaped or kite shield-shaped valves or plates called scuta plates, labeled number 5. Now, the shape of the suture running across the opening is also an important clue in identification, as I'm sure at least some of you will realize. We'll come on to this in detail as we look at some of the individual species. Now, the plates open along the longitudinal median line that you can see going sort of north-south through across the aperture to allow the feather-like legs to emerge for feeding. Sorry, I'm just trying to, there we go. I'm just trying to get rid of, I'm just gonna, yeah. So I'm just moving something on the screen so that I can see my notes more clearly. So, yeah, along with there's also a fleshy flap, the turgoscutal flap, which runs along the free edge of the tergum and scutum on each side of the opening. And the color of that is also useful in species identification, because surprisingly enough, it's actually quite easy to see if you can get the barnacle to open or half open. Intertidal species that are exposed to the, tell you what, I've got a few pictures here. So here's a picture of some barnacles with their legs out, they're with the aperture open and the legs are out. And you can also see the this turgoscutal flap coming around the edge of the opening. In this case, it's rather a nice pale yellow color. Okay, and so you can pretty much see into the barnacle and you can see it sticking its legs out and feeding. Now, the intertidal species that are exposed to the atmosphere for, through the tidal cycle, these have a little breathing hole called a micropyle, and that, I don't know if you can see the arrow on my on the screen there, but this is the opening. The shell is sort of starting to open, and this is the gap that's opening between the two sides of the operculum. And these rather nice blue structures are the turgoscutal flaps. And in the middle, there's a little hole, which you can't actually see it as a hole, but it is marked by an orange dot. And that's a little hole called a micropyle, which the animal can use to sample the environment without opening its shell completely. And the color of these turgoscutal flaps that you can see here, these are also another useful identity clue. Okay, so now I'm going to just crack on through a few acorn barnacles and give you a few identity clues for each one. Some of you may know some better than others. Some of you might know all of them. And also a few photographs which will hopefully illustrate some of the identification clues. So first of all, in this diagram here on the left, this is Semibalanus balanoides. So this is also known as the northern barnacle. That's its common name or vernacular name. There's one of the main things that you can tell Semibalanus by is this rostral plate at the anterior end here. So the rostral plate at the back, sorry, at the front end is wider than the aperture. So here's the aperture and here's the rostral plate. And it overlaps the lateral plates to either side. So that's a big characteristic of semi-balanus balanoides and one or two other species as well. It also has a diamond-shaped um, opening or aperture. Um, Sometimes it looks diamond-shaped, sometimes it looks a little bit truncated at the rostral end. So you could maybe call it a truncated diamond or a pentagonal shape. And God, there's something showing right in the middle of the screen here, right over my writing. Um, the suture that runs across between the turgor and the scuta here in various acorn barnacles, including this species, uh, is sinuous or stepped. And that's very characteristic of semi-balanus balanoides, that particular shape of stepping in the suture. Um, right. And here is a photograph just showing some real live semi-balanus balanoides. You can see here, it's got this diamond shape opening. It's got this sinuous suture going across between the turgor and the scuta. You can see this one down here. You can actually see the turgoscutal flap, which is white in this species, and you can also see the micropyle open there in this particular one, even though the legs aren't out. So it's still closed, but it's starting to sample the environment. So here you can see the rostral plate overlapping the lateral plates to either side. So it's very clear in these particular live specimens. And here's a photo from Lynn. Well, this is one of Lynn's photographs of another semi-balanus from somewhere else, probably down in Dorset, I guess. But it shows you the nice diamond shape opening, um, the um, the broad rostral plate here opening, overlapping the plates to either side. You can see that in this particular individual, the plates are kind of becoming a little bit calcified, and it's quite an old individual probably. And sometimes, in the older animals, it's quite the plates all sort of merge, and it's difficult to see exactly where the joins are. So that particular characteristic with the rostral plate might not be so obvious in very old specimens, but it also has the kite, the turgor and the scuta. They're kind of sort of sunken within the opening, and that can be quite characteristic sometimes of semi-balanus balanoides. And I know Lynn has told me before that she thinks they have a slightly more creamy color on the shore than some of the other species. Okay, now, as you can all probably guess, the northern barnacle is actually pretty commonly recorded. It's a northern species. It's intertidal. I mean, it does occur a little bit in the subtidal as well, but basically it's intertidal, and it occurs on all shores around Britain and Ireland. And I'm sure you are all pretty familiar with it. Now, there are two other barnacle species which share the intertidal along with semi-balanus balanoides that we're going to run through next. The first of these is Cathamalus stellatus, which is the vernacular, which I never knew. I never knew this, but it was Polly's stellate barnacle. I just know it as Cathamalus stellatus. But so this differs, as you can see, from semi-balanus in having a narrow rostral plate at the front end here. And in fact, it's about the same width or narrower than the aperture. So that's a heavy clue for telling Cathamalus species apart from semi-balanus species. And in fact, it's overlapped by the lateral plates to either side. So now the other main characteristic of this species, if I can just get the arrow moving again, is the rounded shape, the very sort of, it's almost like a worn looking rounded shape of the opening, the aperture. And I'm just going to get a few photos up. This photograph is of an old specimen, so it's difficult to see the rostral plate feature that I was talking about just now, but you can see the very wide aperture there and its very rounded nature and the shape of the suture that goes across the opening. And in fact, it's this species that I was showing you earlier with this bright blue turgoscutal flaps on either side, with a central orange spot around the micropyle or little opening. So this species, as I say, is intertidal, generally occurs in the mid to lower shore, and it's pretty common. It's mainly southern and western shores, all the way from the sort of Channel up to Scotland and potentially into Shetland as well. But there's relatively few records on the East Coast. And in fact, over the weekend at the Porcupine Conference, we were looking for this species on the Fife coastline, just around here on Fife Ness. And I'm not sure if we didn't certainly find it on our bit of the shore, but the other group might have found it in St Andrews itself. But it hasn't got an NBN spot there, so that would be a good thing for porcupine to get into the records. So this is the other Cathamelus species, Cathamelus montagui, or Montague's stellate barnacle. So just like the Cathamelus we just looked at, it has a very narrow rostral plate here, same as or narrower than the aperture, and it's overlapped by the lateral plates to either side. In this barnacle, as you can see here, the opening is distinctively kite-shaped. And here are a few more photographs. Again, these come from Lynn, and these show you examples of kite-shaped barnacles. Pretty old specimens again, so you can see all the plates are pretty much fused on these older specimens. And I've borrowed this photograph from Ian Smith, but here you can see the turgoscutal flaps. They're open, but the legs aren't out yet, and you can see that they're white or pale blue with orange or brown markings on them. So you can see how beautiful these structures are, but how distinctive they are as well. If you're actually looking at live specimens that are open and showing themselves. Okay, it's quite a similar sort of distribution overall to to the previous one, Cathamelus stellatus, mainly confined to southern, western, and some northern shores. Now, we're still in the intertidal here with this species, Perforatus perforatus. Until relatively recently, I think it was called Balanus perforatus, but it's now Perforatus perforatus, and it's called the perforated barnacle. Now, the main characteristic of this is that it has this very steeply conical shape. So it is pretty much like a volcano shape. And the other thing about it is it's often tinged with pink or purple on these calcareous, relatively smooth calcareous plates. It may be very slightly ribbed. Then this drawing shows it slightly, but overall it's relatively smooth compared to some other species. Now in this one, the aperture, the hole at the top, is relatively small in relation to the overall size of the barnacle. This is quite a big barnacle. This is quite chunky. Probably grows up to about 15 mil in length. Tell you what, let's get some photos up. So here's what it looks like in the flesh. And on the shores, you'll often find it on the sort of lower shore, in crevices especially, and underhangs and that sort of in shaded locations. But you can see it sort of pink nature. This is a photograph I took when I was in Alderney last year. And here's another photo. This one's a photo from Lynn. Um, and in terms of distribution, um, this tends to sort of peter out north of Wales, although it has been recorded in various places in Scotland and Ireland, and maybe records are suggesting that it's sort of in the process of moving north, perhaps with climate change or something like that. Now, this is a barnacle that many of you will be slightly more familiar with. It's one of those species that's relatively easy to identify purely because instead of the six plates that Semibalanus and Cathamelus species have, this only has four plates. Um, and it's kind of usually it's very unlike Semibalanus and Cathamelus, which can get pretty old and gnarly and fused and everything. This one on the whole stays relatively neat and ovoid and sort of clean looking. And maybe that's because it's an introduced species. I'm not quite sure. Maybe not so much settles on it or something, or maybe it's got some sort of uh, cleaning protection or something. Yeah, so like some of the other species, there is this aperture here, which is diamond shaped, if you will, or pentagonal, because sometimes the bottom, the top end, the anterior end is um, overlapped by the rostral plate. The tergal sutures here, they've instead of forming a sinuous thing like you get in Semibalanus and Cathamelus, it forms a pretty much arrow straight pattern, meeting in an arrow point centrally along the median line there. And here's a photo. I think this is one of Lynn's, showing this very distinctive shape with the four plates. There's this sort of scoop out of the middle of each plate as you go around. It's almost like a little valley running up each plate. And here you can see the very arrow-like suture. You can see this one is actually just starting to open slightly. The tergoscutal flap in this is white with a central orange marking. So this is intertidal. It occurs on all levels, and it's ever since it was introduced in the 40s, I think it started showing up on the south coast in some of the harbours, probably from bilge water from flying boats or ships. It's been spreading north ever since then, and I remember quite early on, Keith Hiscock found this species up in Shetland. I'm not sure if it's ever been found again up in Shetland, but there are sporadic records of it in Scotland. Now, this is an interesting barnacle. This is a species in a different order from all the other species we've been talking about there in the Balanomorpha. This is in the Verrucomorpha. This is called the wart barnacle, unsurprisingly. I guess that's just because of its general warty appearance. Um, it's um, it's asymmetrical for one thing. It's flattened and it's only made of four plates, although it's very difficult to make out the four plates in the way that the plates themselves are so gnarly and so corrugated that it's quite difficult to make out the joins between the plates. But anyway, they carry these ridges which interlock at these serrated sutures. And to me, Verruca has these lines. They have these lines going across it diagonally and sort of crisscrossing on it. And to me, that is what makes Verruca so distinctive. Now, this species, instead of having, it has an opening in similar to the other barnacles, but instead of having four plates in the top of it that open up down the median line, it has a single D-shaped lid or plate, and it's just hinged on one side. So it doesn't have turgoscutal flaps as such. Um, but sometimes if they're open and you can see them open and you're able to look in, maybe if you have a good photograph of one while it's underwater, the interior shows red through the slit-like opening. So here's a photograph that shows these lines all over it that I was talking about, and another one. I don't actually have a photograph of the interior. I have never caught these open yet with my camera. But this species is quite widespread. This is the thing that you'll find on the lower shore, in algal holdfasts and in crevices and things like that in rocks. But it's mainly subtidal, and it's all coasts, and you get it subtidally as well. And as you can see there, it occurs out in the middle of the North Sea as well. Now, we're going subtidal now. We're sort of leaving the intertidal behind. Um, And this is the first of the properly subtidal ones, Balanus crenatus, or the crenate barnacle. So called because it has these sort of these castellations, pointy castellations around the aperture, as it's kind of shown in these drawings, but it'll show up in some of the photos too. Now, as you see, it's balanus, and in this species, the rostral plate is wider than the aperture. So that's a good check to look for if you're looking at this barnacle underwater and you're kind of interested to kind of check through your identification characters. Um, Often the carinal end, which is this end where the pointy bits are, is higher than the rostrum. So it kind of has quite a sporty looking appearance on the rocks. The aperture is diamond shaped or pentagonal. It's got these teeth around the rim, particularly if they're uneroded. Um, the scuta have growth lines, um, and you can see these growth lines on the scuta here. So this is the sort of diamond. In fact, this is almost a teardrop shape aperture actually in this photograph, but it has these growth lines, and which are quite you do see them in Balanus crenatus. Um, and here's one that's open. And you can see the legs coming out, and you can see the turgoscutal flap in here, which is edged with yellow, pale yellow. And you can see that in these photographs here. Here's the turgoscutal flap showing nicely with edged in yellow. So there, yeah, and there you can see the same thing again. So again, this is a very common species. It may occur in the lower shore, but generally it's subtidal, and you'll get it pretty much on all coasts and offshore as well. Now to balanus, which is we're getting into the barnacles are increasing in size as we go through them at the moment. So 6 plates. This one can get up to 5 centimeters in length from front to back. It's a tall, steep cone, similar to Perforatus that we just looked at just now, but this one is usually, often, very distinctively ridged from the top of the plates down to the bottom. It's quite distinctively ridged. And again, like in Balanus crenatus, the top end of it here that is higher than the rostral end. Here's a photograph. Again, this one's from Ian Smith. The opening is teardrop shaped. The operculum is deeply recessed in it when closed, as you can see from the photograph there. And often the turgor, especially when the turgoscutal flaps are open, the turga sort of stick up like a beak shaped. Um, like you can see here. And the turgoscutal flap is brown or purplish, and it's edged in yellow. But you can see the turgoscutal flap here emerging from between. These are the two turga sticking up as they open, and these are the scuta here with the turgoscutal flaps in between. This one is subtidal to about 150 meters. It's a northern species, so it likes cold water. This one here is an example, just totally covered in sponge. So it's only the orifice that you can see and the fact that it's open, you can see the beak and the turgoscutal flaps showing through quite nicely. So yeah, this is a northern species, and you can see that is reflected in the number of records there. It's slightly northern heavy there, but very common underwater. Now, moving on to slightly different, some slightly different types of barnacles, uh, acorn barnacles. This is one called Adna anglica. Uh, it doesn't seem to have a vernacular name, although I guess you could call it cup coral barnacle or something like that, or solitary coral barnacle, something like that, because it always is attached to solitary cup corals, not necessarily to Caryophylla smithii, the Devonshire cup coral, because there are other coral species in the UK. This is quite important when it comes to coloration and so on. But it will attach itself to various species. It's just that Caryophylla smithii is the one that's most common, the one that we see mostly. Um, the barnacle itself is a single unit. All the plates in it are fused, so unlike the other barnacles. And in addition, it sits on a cup-shaped circular base. So as you can see here, um, it can be slightly ribbed. And what happens is it's overgrown and colored by coral tissue. And you can see that. So they're often suffused with pink, or they look pink. And that's really because that's the tissue of the barnacle coming through tissue of the coral when the coral's out. It's come through and it's covering over the barnacle completely, except for the opening. The opening at the top is kind of small in relation to the size of the barnacle itself. This is a small barnacle, by the way. It's only about 6 to 8 millimeters in maximum size length. Um, but the opening is small and variable in shape. And there is a turgoscutal flap, and it's a sheath with white vertical bars in it. I'm not sure. I've really got a good close-up photo of turgoscutal flaps for this particular species. Now, here's an example on a different species of coral. I'm not sure where this was taken. This is a David Kipling photo. So I'm not sure where it might have been. Well, it might be from Lundy, I guess. But you can see here the barnacle here on the side, totally yellow, covered with the sunset coral tissue. Um, this is a southern species, definitely in general. You do get it intertidally occasionally, but it's subtidal, basically. Um, its distribution is centered on the south and southwest Britain and Ireland. But I suspect, I've been wondering if it's moving north because we see it quite commonly in uh, here around Rathlin, for example, and also up here in the Sound of Mull. It's quite common actually. We were seeing it a lot last year. Now, this is something I have never seen myself, and it's probably because I was never aware of it. and I've never looked carefully at Disidia fragilis. Hopefully you all know what the sponge Disidia fragilis looks like. But next time you see some, have an extra special look at it and see if you can see this species. Um, it's so in some ways, I reckon it looks not dissimilar from Adna, the previous species we were looking at. But this one, the plates are all separate still. It has six thin spiny plates growing off a round circular cup-shaped basis. It's a small species. And it's not attached to rock. It's embedded in the sponge, Disidia fragilis. I think in other parts of the world, it does go in other sponges, but in the UK, it seems to be Disidia fragilis. And it uses these spines on these plates that it has, I guess, to help secure it in place within the sponge framework of the sponge. So the aperture is large. Oh, here's an actual photo of one. Um, can't remember whose this is. Um, but you can see the plates, and you can see the sort of wide aperture here as well, with the sort of teeth sticking up all around it. You can see the spines on each of the plates as well. Quite so you can see it's quite spiny, and how it's probably quite well adapted to being held in place within the sponge. I think this is a photo I just borrowed off the NBN um, website because there are so few photographs of it, good photos of it. And this is a photo taken by Lynn of Disidia fragilis, which allegedly has a castor in it. I'm not sure I've seen it, but I don't know, maybe it's these holes here. I guess, often you'll probably only see the orifices evident in the sponge matrix. So it's subtidal species, basically. And again, it's pretty much confined to southwest Britain and Ireland. So perhaps I'll only see it if I go on my holidays to Dorset or somewhere. Um, An Amphibalanus amphitrite, or the striped barnacle. Again, this is something I've never seen. Six plates. Thing about this is it's very smooth and neat, and it characteristically has these pink stripes going down each of the plates, as you can see in the photograph to the right. Diamond-shaped aperture with the turgoscutal sutures sort of arrow-shaped again, like that. And in this, I'm not sure if I've got a photo of the, oh yeah. You can see here that the turgoscutal flap is white with a edged in pink, rather fetchingly in pink, and it does have these dark bands across it. One, two, three, four in all these cases. You can see that. This is an introduced species. So like Balanus Ostrominius modestus, this is introduced, only found at artificially warmed sites. So that's why the dots on the map here are so few, and why generally you won't be bumping into it in most of the places that we go diving. Um, I've been told that it's found in sort of power station outfalls and places with warm water, basically. And then when power stations close down, the barnacle itself disappears because it can't maintain itself. It can't maintain its population as a viable unit. I believe it's intertidal and subtidal, but I guess it's a pretty shallow species anyway. And another amphibalanus. This is the bay barnacle, another introduced species. Um, six calcareous plates, um, yellowish. Allegedly, this has a sort of a yellowish tinge to the epidermis on the plates. And again, as a balanoid, it has a wide rostral plate here. Um, the It has a usually has a toothed rim in uneroded specimens, so you know that it's got teeth around the top. It has growth lines in the suture. I'm not sure if I've got the. Yeah, I had to borrow these. I couldn't find photos of it, so I borrowed a couple from Ian Smith. But you can see here the spines around the top of the shells. I have asked him, by the way. Um, the and Yeah, you can see the spines just opening up as well, although it's maybe not so easy to see the color of the turgoscutal flap. Um, yeah, it's white crossed by five dark bands. I think there's another picture. Yeah, so here you can see the turgoscutal flaps very nicely. So if you go to Ian Smith's um, uh, site here, he covers pretty much all of the intertidal barnacles and some of the subtidal ones too, all the acorn barnacles, that is. And he has absolutely brilliant photos of showing all of the various features that are helpful in identification. Um, this species is subtidal, but it is generally confined to estuarine and brackish areas, and hence its name, vernacular name, bay barnacle. This one, as I've just made a little note down here, is very similar to Balanus crenatus in many ways, in its sort of shape, the fact that it's crenate round the top, diamond-shaped aperture, and so on. But the difference is between them is that Balanus crenatus is restricted to fully saline water. It can only occur in, properly salty water, whereas improvisus can only occur in estuarine or brackish areas. I think it's outcompeted if it tries to live in by other species if it tries to live in open seawater. Coming back into sort of deep water now with Corona hammeri. This is a very large barnacle, up to 7 centimeters in length, or yeah, uh, biggest diameter. It starts off like Perforatus and like Balanus, with which it shares similarities. It's a tall conical barnacle initially, made of six plates. Um, but as it grows, so you can see here, it uh, it it grows in a sort of a cylindrical manner rather than sort of narrowing to a volcano pointy top. It stays cylindrical, and it often, in the process, stoops over to the carinal end with age as well, as you can see in these barnacles here. Another thing about this particular species, it's quite characteristic, I believe, is that it grows on it grows on other hammer barnacles as well. So you can see here's a barnacle growing on another barnacle, which itself is growing on the side of this barnacle. So it grows on conspecifics, and it also grows on other. I mean, it does grow on rock as well, but you'll find this one on large modiolus and things like that, for example. So it's very large. It has a crenate rim, as you can see. It's got lots of teeth. Um, the turga in this species are vertical. Here's a good shot of it. This is from the Corryvreckan on the pinnacle at the top of it, taken by a friend of mine. So here you can see this is basically sort of conical in shape. So it hasn't sort of developed this tubular appearance. Um, but you can see it's got growth lines on the scuta. You can see the distinct beaks. These plates here are the scuta, and these are the turga. So in species like Chiarona, the turga are pretty much vertical, and that's why you don't see so much of them, but they sort of stick up as beaks. This one sort of almost has its turgoscutal flaps visible, but they're white, crossed by four dark bands and edged in yellow as well. Some more photographs. These photos are all from Corrie Vrecken. I should point it out. You can actually see other Chiarona growing on this large Chiarona, and you can see the same thing here. Chiarona growing on Chiarona. The thing that they like in their environment is current. Okay, depth as well, but they are found in shallow water as long as there's lots of current. And they've been found growing, for instance, on tidal energy devices in 2 or 3 meters. So yeah, here's a kind of a wider angle shot showing the uh, several individuals of Chiarona hammeri, all growing over each other and surrounded by Dendrodoa and other barnacles and coprolids and things. So yeah, it's a cold water northern species, likes deep water and strong currents, and extends from the Northern Isles down south down the west coast. So that's a quick summary form whiz through some of the acorn barnacles. What we're going to do now, and spot the deliberate mistake I've made here, but that should say stalked barnacles, okay? But what we're going to do now is just have a look at a few of the stalked barnacles. So stalked barnacles, also known as pedunculate barnacles, and they're also known as goose barnacles, um, uh, owing to their shape. I think people thought they resembled the neck and head of a goose. And I think there was actually a sort of a folklore belief that geese actually originated from goose barnacles. But yeah. So they these as perhaps many of you will know, they consist of a flexible stalk or peduncle, um, which can be extended in some species. So it's the peduncle and also the head, or capitulum. So you can see this label here says capitulum, and this is the peduncle down here in this drawing that I've borrowed. Um, yeah, so this is the equivalent of the sort of the body of the barnacle, if you like, with all the calcareous plates and things enclosing the animal inside. And the peduncle is just basically it's the means to attach it to the substratum. It's not as simple as that. There are structures within the peduncle sometimes. So the capitulum or the head may be covered in various numbers of calcareous plates. And it's the number of those plates, their shape, their sort of disposition, and their arrangement and color and texture and so on. These are all key identification features. And the plates open up here. Here's the tergum here. You've got tergum on each side. And here is the slit where the aperture opens up as the terga open up. And that's where the animal inside can stick its legs out to feed in the water. And there'll be some photos of this coming up. Now, most pedunculate barnacles are oceanic, and they live in warmer seas, but they appear more or less sporadically from time to time in British and Irish waters because they attach themselves to floating objects such as logs, seaweed, buoys, plastic debris, and so on and so forth. And other species are found exclusively on other animals, such as turtles, fish, whales as well. Only one or two live in the Northeast Atlantic, and That's going to be the first two that we have a look at, and most of the and all of the others are oceanic vagrants, if you like. So, uh, the first of the species that we're going to look at is this lovely animal, Scalpellum scalpellum, or the velvet goose barnacle. I think it's called velvet goose barnacle because of the texture that it has when if you were to run your finger on it. It looks quite silty. It looks quite sort of velvety sometimes on the occasions I've seen it. Um, so here is the head with the feet coming out to feed out of the tergal opening. And this is the peduncle bit here attached to a piece of debris or no, or to a hydroid or something like that. Because scalpellum is subtidal and it occurs all around the UK and offshore. It's the only subtidal species that we're likely to see, in fact, of stalked barnacle. It's characterized by having 14 plates, that's 7 on each side, okay? Um, the other thing that's characteristic about it is the shape. So it's got this characteristic sort of beak shape on the tip of the capitulum or head. And generally, it's a silty grayish brown in color. So here's a photo from Lynn showing it attached to some hydroids. Uh, uh, it's typically attached to, and it's kind of typically well hidden and sort of cryptic within epifauna, particularly hydroids and erect bryozoans. And you'll get it on all sorts of substrata as well. It's so, because just like you get hydroids on all sorts of substrata. So you often when you delve into the middle of bunches of hydroids, you'll find scalpellum attached to it. So, as I say, it's the only stalked barnacle likely to be found sublitterally in shelf areas of Britain and Ireland. Here's a photograph of mine, which I think is perhaps showing the sort of more the velvety nature of the animal itself, and it's got its feeding legs out as well in the water column. And this is a wonderful clear shot of Lynn, taken by Lynn, showing it very uncharacteristically clean and tidy, but it does show you the structure rather well. Um, yeah, it's subtidal and occurs offshore. Um, I think that 6 records in NBN is a misprint. I think that's from something else. Um, but it occurs all around the UK. And yeah, ignore what I've written at the bottom there. It occurs all around the UK and Ireland as well. This is another species. This is the Polychipes, or the rocky shore goose barnacle. So this is native as well, barely. It's barely native. Um, and as you can see, it has a completely, although broadly speaking, it has the similar structures to the previous one, Scalpellum, the subtidal one. Um, it looks completely different. So it has large numbers of big white teeth, big white plates all over the capitulum. Um, and characteristically, the distal ones, these ones around here, are large. The capitulum is laterally compressed and it looks blunt, as you can see from that picture. And it has a dark coloured peduncle, um, which is highly contractile and is generally shorter than the capitulum. Now, this here's a photo of it. I stole this one for the purpose of this presentation, but it shows you very easily its characteristic appearance with these plates, including these large ones distally on the capitulum, and also the very dark coloured uh, peduncle down here. This one is extremely rare. It's so I think when we say it's native, I think it's sort of just barely hanging on. Uh, there's just been a few records, mostly from Cornwall, I think. Um, it's exclusively intertidal, and you can find it hidden in very deep crevices in the extreme lower shore, on very exposed shores as well. Okay, moving on to some, just a few, just to kind of give an idea of the range of species that are seen around Britain and Ireland. This is the striped gooseneck barnacle, or Conchoderma virgatum. Um, this one, as you can see, just looks completely different to the rest. The capitulum is striped, as you can see in the picture there, striped longitudinally with dark chocolate bands, usually on a very pale blue or purplish background. Um, and there's a nice picture from Lynn showing it in all its glory. Um, it has a very small number of widely separated white shell plates, 5 shell plates. And I'm just going to go back to the picture to show you that it's got this trilobed scutum. Trilobed. It looks a bit like I don't know, a wishbone or a fossilized shark's tooth or something like that. Um, so the capitulum appears mainly membranous, as you can see in this photo here, and it blends into the peduncle with very little visible demarcation. It's usually attached to floating objects, but this species is also characteristically attached to whales and some fish as well. It's quite a large one, up to 7 centimeters total length. But records of it are rare, only two in NBN. It's the fact that that's the only spot I could see in NBN. But I do happen to know that it's been recorded from other places. These are, are two photos of a whole bunch of striped gooseneck barnacles that were found by a friend of mine, Miles O'Reilly, who works at Seeper in Scotland, and he dug these off a whale, and I think these are actually in situ on the whale. So what you have here is I'm trying to get the pointer to show. Yeah, you've this long, thin black thing is in fact uh, a parasitic copepod, which in turn is attached to a barnacle, which in turn is embedded in the flesh of the whale. And attached to the parasitic copepod is this are these bunches of gooseneck striped barnacles. You can see the blue and chocolate stripes on each of them. Very characteristic. Yeah. So that was a sighting. He actually took those photos in the Forth, that the whale stranded in the Forth. Uh, Here's another species of stork barnacle or goose barnacle. This is called the boy barnacle or Dosema fascicularis. Again, so it's got this sort of characteristic goose barnacle sort of shape, the capitulum here with plates over a sort of a membranous sort of covering to the animal. Here's the peduncle attaching it to the piece of flotsam that this one's attached to. So this species has 5 uh, large, rather angular, very thin, translucent white shell plates. Um, so they're very delicate looking. The characteristic thing about them is that the carina, this here, is keeled. So it comes to a sort of there's a sharp ridge running down that side of it. And it also has a very sharp umbo, which is this thing here. And that shows up rather well in some of these photos. These are photos taken by Lynn, so I guess they must have come up on the shore near her. And here's just a lovely photo, which just clearly shows all the identification features you'd actually need to see, I think. But this is the uh, very sharply angled umbo that I was talking about. The peduncle is very short. Um, this is it can secrete its own float, and it's the only known barnacle to do this. And I guess that's it. That might be it here. So it's secreted its own float, but it's also attached to a piece of debris by the look of it. And so these species, like other oceanic vagrants, they're typically attached to floating seaweed, feathers, and tar balls, and amplified by this marvelous sort of polystyrene-like structure that it secretes itself. It's actually, it's recorded not that infrequently, recorded as strandings around southwest Britain, west coast of Ireland, and the west coast of Scotland, and the Northern Isles as well. This is another quite commonly recorded species that kind of turns up as strandings on our shoreline from time to time. In fact, this is the commonest species, or commonest lepas species. This is Lepas anatifera, or the common goose barnacle. So you can see here the capitulum and the peduncle down here. It's got 5 large opaque white shell plates. These plates are individually smooth, and only they might have very fine striations in them. The membrane bordering the plates is often colored in shades of yellow and orange, at least in fresh material it is. If you really want to get down to the nitty-gritty, there is on the scutum there is a small tooth that doesn't occur in other species, so that sort of helps tell it apart from other Lepas species. But I don't have any photos of that. The peduncle is very leathery, purplish brown, darkest at the top nearest the capitulum, and the peduncle doesn't have any scales. And here's a photo of a whole bunch of them attached to something taken by Lynn. So yeah, as with other goose barnacles, it's typically attached to floating objects and on stranded flotsam and jetsam on the shorelines. It can be quite big, up to 5 centimeters in length. That's just the head of it. That's just the white head. But the peduncle can extend to over 80 centimeters. So this is a species that can be dangling quite a long way beneath whatever it's hanging on to. In other parts of the world, Lepas species are eaten, but yeah, not sure how tasty they are, really. So this is the commonest species to be stranded on British and Irish shores, although not so much down the North Sea coast. Another Lepas, we're coming near to the end now. Again, similar number of plates to the others, but their shape and disposition and sculpture is very, very different. So these plates, they're usually very close fitting with not so much gap between them. The plates are strongly striated and radially ridged, and sometimes they're so strongly ridged that they have little spine that shows as little spines on the scuta and terga. The peduncle is short, brownish, often orange tinged at the top, nearest the capitulum in fresh specimens. And here's Lynn's been very adept at getting photographs of these whenever they turn up. So this is what they look like in the flesh. So yeah, obviously it's attached to something there. Not quite sure what. This is uh, very this is a small goose barnacle, um, uh, which I think I said. This is only 2.5 centimeters in length, I believe, and the peduncle is always shorter than that. So it's quite a small species. So I guess that's one of its distinguishing features. Uh, like the previous species, this is Lepas pectinata, small goose barnacle. Um, this is found reasonably. There's a nice photograph showing the sculpture, the very distinctive sculpture on the shell plates of this particular species. It's found stranded reasonably often on British and Irish western shores, and again recorded least along the North Sea coast. So that's basically it. I've come to the end of going through barnacles. What have we learned? I'd like to think that although barnacles are thought of by many of us as tricky to identify, in fact, I think I've been finding that most barnacles should be possible to identify them pretty readily, either from the arrangement of their plates or in the case of living specimens and good photos by their colors and other visible characters. At least I hope that's what I've shown. I just want to acknowledge people for their use of their images. Lynn Baldock, Mike Markey, and Ian Smith. Thank you very much. And thank you. I'm just going to
Ian,
stop
a
sharing
question.
there.
A, a question as to where you're getting your distribution maps from. Did you pull them from NBN?
Yeah. Those are all NBN, and I mean I have noticed in it's obviously difficult to tell for every species. I'm not that knowledgeable. I haven't, I'm doing quite a lot of reading at the moment on these species, but I haven't got to the stage where I'm fully knowledgeable about them all. But I'm aware that there are records where NBN doesn't have records and so on. So